Hello, this is CUDAN Open Lab Seminar on Monday, April 28th, 2025. And today we have Maciej Eder, and I apologize if my pronunciation is
very good.
Amateur. The topic today is Computational Literary Studies, a gentle introduction, and we look very much forward to this. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you very much, everyone here, for coming. I hope there'll be some visitors for this video. So the topic of my today's talk is computational literary studies, which kind of determined my choice of the logo and the slide template, because I'm affiliated with the Polish Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Polish Language in Kraków, Poland. That's my or has been so far my first affiliation, but I have switched very recently to the University of Tartu, where we started a project Digits, which is going to be an era chair devoted to textual studies. However, I'm still the PI of the project CLS Infra, and the CLS stands for Computational Literary Studies, and that's a relatively new field, or this field has been around without getting its name for a while, but now we can say that it's already around. And I would like to introduce you to some basic topics or basic notions of this newly established field of CLS, or computational literary studies. Then I will move on to some more advanced topics, because my understanding is that here in this room there are some people that might be very new to this area, but also some people that are looking forward to something more advanced. So I will try to cover those two. So a few introductory words to this CLS, or Computational Literary Studies. It has a long history, if you think of that, but as we think of it nowadays, this is analyzing usually large amounts of textual data by computational techniques. Usually this is literary works, such as novels or dramatical texts, covering usually spanning a few decades, or going on a larger scale to see something that is not very trivial to see with the naked eye. And if we really go back to the first ideas of this CLS, or literary studies, we should probably think of Leon Battista Alberti and his work on the breaking codes, basically on the ciphers. And one of the chapters of his treatise on the ciphers he devoted to measuring the frequencies of vowels in poetry versus prose. And he discovered, allegedly, I'm not sure if it's still valid, but he discovered that one of those genres is more towards using an A, as opposed to the other that is more likely to use more e's as a textual feature that he allegedly discovered. But that was the beginning of thinking in quantitative terms about literature. It wasn't quite seminal back then, but now I think this is definitely a seminal work. If I think of a really game-changing work, then it's definitely Computation into Criticism by John Burroughs, published in 1987 or so, on Jane Austen and her novels. Because stylometric and quantitative analysis of style had been around for some time, however, exclusively focused on attributing anonymous texts to some candidate authors. What, however, John Burroughs did, he said that, hey, let's use this methodology to address the bigger questions of literature. So what he basically did, his idea of computation into criticism can be thought of, or that's what how he developed this idea, was that if you think of the most subjective field ever, this is probably literary criticism, that everything depends on how good an interpreter you are, how good you are in engaging with the text and with the subject of your study. However, he says, what if we supplement this ideas, literary criticism, by some exact methodologies? Now, that was quite a statement back then in the 80s. And counting from this book, 1987 book, we see a lot of other very seminal topics that are built on top of this computation and the criticism original idea. What John Burroughs did it in his book, he looked at the works by Jane Austen, and he took apart, separated the words spoken by particular characters, Bennett, Darcy, whatever, and then he looked at those the samples of words spoken by fictional characters using principal component analysis and other techniques, other multivariate techniques to see if there is any separation between, say, the language of the lower class male characters as opposed to middle class or upper middle class female characters, and so on and so forth. It was quite seminal, and it led to some other very seminal concepts that came later. And these were probably the best known, one being Distant Reading by Franco Moretti, published in the form of a book, but this idea had been published earlier in the form of some papers. Distant Reading being reading without looking at the text themselves, but instead looking at the metadata of the texts, looking at how if you just collect a large number of title pages over a century or so, then you are able to observe some trends, some developments, and some decays of some genres, some the length of titles, whatever you might be interested in. So metadata alone, he said, or he claimed, was enough to say quite a lot about literature from a bird's eye perspective. And then the next one was the person from Franco Moretti's lab, Matt Joggers, who published a book, Macroanalysis, who basically combined the idea of John Burroughs of this computation into criticism with distant reading. So what he did, he not only looked at the metadata, but also looked at the data themselves, at the textual data themselves. And then, from there on, there is a bunch of very interesting and the books that were step forwards for sure in many different directions. I'm mentioning here Distant Horizon by Ted Underwood, but this is not the only author that should be mentioned here. Steve Ramsey is another person, Andre Piper, and some other names that have also put some their 2 cents into this idea of doing literary analysis on style using computational linguistic techniques, if I may, condense this idea into just one sentence. But not only was it looking at the text themselves, there are also some ideas and some perspectives to look at the text from the perspective of the reader. And here's an example of this kind of work by Carina van Dalen-Oskam from Amsterdam. What she did, she asked the question of literary quality. Can we tell apart good books from bad books? But first thing she did, she ran a survey, a big national survey, like 30,000 respondents she got, asking them which out of 401 books that she gave the evaluators to go through are good or bad on a scale from 1 to 7. So the literary quality being one of those, and literariness being the other dimension. So is this book very literary and very good, or not literary? Those 2 dimensions were covered. And only then she looked back using the stalmetric methodologies to the books themselves in order to say if there are correlations between what the people think and some textual properties. And she actually found that indeed there are some textual properties in the thematic structure rather than the style itself, but still some features could be observed. If I'm talking about computational literary studies, I cannot omit, another very big perspective. This is quantitative linguistics. I'm, showing just one book, but there's plenty of those. Harold Bayen being one example, but maybe not even the best one. But what made computational literary studies so attractive is that it was rejoining after many, many decades the literary and the linguistic perspective. And now with the linguistic tools, we can say more about literature. So that's why I'm mentioning the quantitative and computational linguistics here. Computational linguistics also because of the NLP pipelines and NLP thinking that is so important for doing CLS. So if I was to just run very briefly through all of the concept, it would be the already mentioned computation to criticism and distant reading, but also this idea of authorship attribution based on countable features of text. This will be, broadly speaking, digital humanities with their data-centric approach. It will be a thing that we usually don't think that much of, and this is language resources. The situation that we saw 10 years ago and that we see nowadays with the advent of, say, HathiTrust and this kind of big, fat collections of literary works. Take Gutenberg books alone. That's a big collection that was not there like 15 years ago. It also changed the landscape radically, and it made it possible to do research in the CLS area, but also the digital libraries and their policies of digitizing more and more materials. Depending on the national level, some countries decide to go into the historical dimension, some other choose some other things to be covered by digitization. It depends, but still, the availability of the libraries, digital libraries, has changed the picture radically. And of course, NLP being a big thing, and machine learning, big data, AI, those things, those computational dimensions without which doing CLS wouldn't be possible. So if I was to say what I personally see is so attractive in CLS, computational literary studies, it would be, well, I list here three things. The one is the scientific method, so reproducibility. I mean, this empiricism-centric approach or empirical paradigm. So you observe some phenomenon and then you try to model it artificially, and the closer you get to the data you observe, the more confidently you can say that you've learned something, right? This so-called statistical scientific method that has proven to be so effective, so efficient for the earth sciences and the exact sciences. So that's one of the things, this scientific method with its reproducibility paradigm and empiricism. The other being the scale. So rather than looking at like 20 books, we can now look at 20,000 books if we can enjoy such a big collection. So this access to unprecedented scale makes, in my view, a big difference. If we were speculating about, say, canonicity like 50 years ago, basing on just 20 canonized books of the Victorianism, it was a radically different picture than we can see right now when we take 20,000 books that are already digitized, with some caveats, because again, the question what was digitized and what was not digitized, and to which extent this idea of canonicity impacted the decisions to digitize the books, that's a different thing. That's one of the caveats. There's many different caveats that the CLS has to face, but that's a different thing. And finally, accuracy. That's what you can see very, very nicely when you do stylometric analysis of authorial style. The features that you don't see at a glance when you use computational techniques is just more accurate to pinpoint some textual features that you normally don't see at a glance. So if we think of this, of the applications of the CLS, the computational literary studies, it doesn't have to be analyzing the linguistic, purely linguistic data or the textual data. It can be the analysis of just co-appearance of the characters on stage, for example, on stage, or the structure of characters in a novel, or the other actors, right, or agents, how they interact one with another. Here is a very simple example of an ancient tragedy by Sophocles, Oedipus Tyrannus, and we've got a network of characters, how they interact, who's speaking to him, basically. If you just look at one of those networks, it basically says nothing. But if you compare like 30 or 30,000 of those dramatic texts across a time span of, say, 1,000 years, then you can see some patterns develop, for example. That's one of the dimensions that you might want to cover. Another dimension that we in Kraków tend to do is a large-scale analysis of textual similarities. Here is an example of the work by a colleague of mine, Jan Rybicki, who has digitized 1,000 Polish novels covering the span of like 1850 all the way to early 2000s. And he marked the metadata from where the given text was translated. So the source language. The white is English, the red is probably Russian, the green is French, something like that. I'm not going to go into detail right now, but just to show you that you can say something on a bigger scale if you just contrast the metadata with the textual data at your disposal. So what we need to do successfully do CLS or computational literary studies is a combination of, well, good data sets, which we didn't have a couple of years ago, more than 10 years ago, at least. This is the need of tools, suitable tools or tailored scripts in Python, C++, whatever. Some theoretical considerations or methodology adapted usually from computer sciences, but that's not always the case. And of course, the computer power that, again, was not the case like 20 years ago. Now I remember my first approach to like 20 or 30 novels. That was a big deal for the computer to compute it, to calculate all the distances between the texts. It was like a couple of megabytes. The corpus size was a couple of megabytes, but still that was a deal. Now it is not at all, right? So the computer power is at our disposal. So we've got all those elements, in one place. However, I just want to mention before we go any further that unlike what we might think, CLS is not an individual endeavor anymore. I mean, all those data sets, all those language resources, there are people behind that. There's like big work by many people that we can just grab the final layer and just analyze, but it wouldn't have been possible without the big work of those people on many different layers, and which leads us to the concept of research infrastructures and the importance of research infrastructures. Also for CLS, also for computational literary studies. I'm mentioning that in the context of the CLS project, which is basically infrastructural, and then I will devote just a few minutes to discuss what I mean by that. So we, the humanists, have always basically enjoyed some infrastructures without noticing. Infrastructure, a good description of an infrastructure is that there is something you use, but you don't even realize you do use it. So such as a library, it has always existed somewhere, right? You're just borrowing books and working on a PhD dissertation without even noticing that there must have been someone to build this library first. This is the journals and the network of journals, the peer review system, publishers. There's plenty of different kinds of infrastructures in the humanities. In the hard sciences, we are accustomed to think that this is those big toys like the Hadron Colliders, those big toys that the nuclear physicists need. However, in the humanities, we also need infrastructures. When we switch to digital humanities, however, the landscape of the infrastructures might look slightly different. And here's an example of, and of many, just an example of a dictionary that is being edited at my institute, at the Institute of Polish Language, Polish Academy of Sciences, of the 17th century Polish language that, the material for which was collected over like more 50 years. And only a couple of years ago, they started to turn it into a digital dictionary, being in de facto part of an infrastructure. Another example of an infrastructure, that's an ELTE corpus, which is in effect one of the effects of the cost action distance reading, led by Professor Christoph Schoch a couple of years ago. And ELTE was meant to be a freely accessible, not copyrighted at all, corpus of the novels across at least 10 languages. So the aim was to collect at least 1,200 full-sized novels in at least 10 languages. And now we've got like more than 2,000 novels that are freely available, all are compliant with a specific TI markup. And they try to be also balanced in terms of the number of female authors, male authors, short novellas, longer novels. It is not met in every single situation, but the idea was to just keep this final ultimate goal in mind. So you can just get this corpus for whatever analysis you want. Another example of an infrastructure and a part of the CLS infra project is the Dracor corpus. Some of you might be familiar with. So what is absolutely fantastic about this Dracor corpus is not only the fact that it is a collection of corpora, it's like 20 corpora in several languages, some of them quite big. As you can see, the French collection is like more than 1,500 full-size dramatic texts, which is quite a lot. But also, what is absolutely fantastic about this the corpus or a hub for corpora is that if you've got your own corpus, which is compliant with the requirements, you can just submit there to their GitHub, and it will become the part of this bigger Dracor collection. So why it is important to mention it, the reason is that all these corpora, particular corpora, are compliant with the same standard, right? So which is super important if you think of one corpus speaking to another, and if you think in terms of your Python script being usable for any of those corpora individually. Not only that, because the no, I don't have this slide, because the Dracor hub is also enjoying this or introducing this idea of programmable corpora, so that you can program what you want to suck from this hub. And using an API interface, you can write a very short script. For example, I want only a French texts that are not comedies, but tragedies only written by female authors and cover the span of this and that. You can program your wish or whatever, and then you can use the API interface to grab as many texts to meet your requirements as you like. So that's this idea of programmable corpora that is also very novel and very in line with the CLS thinking. And with this being said, a few words about the project, and then I will switch gears and go to something maybe more exciting for some of you. the CLS Infra project, which is actually about to conclude in a couple of months' time, was an infrastructural project for doing exactly that. Not really for building an infrastructure from scratch, but for looking around and trying to combine the already existing elements into one more or less coherent infrastructure. So we were to provide the glue rather between those elements rather than to build any parts from scratch. So if we think of the hard science, as already said, the infrastructure is usually those big toys, those telescopes, servers, whatever, right? Those big physical objects. In the humanities, as already said, mostly this, publishing houses, journals, monographs, libraries, this kind of circulation of knowledge, or I mean, the infrastructure to increase the circulation of knowledge. However, in the age, the notion of infrastructure is not as, it's a bit blurry, to be honest, because not only do we need the libraries, not only do we need the servers, but also, well, the data sets, which might be living entities. We need some theoretical considerations, some other layers of this infrastructure. So if we if we theorize about infrastructures in the age, this is not just a physical object that we might think of. In this CLS Infra project, we think of infrastructure as a very non-coherent ecosystem of firstly text collections or data sets or corpora, where we just look for high quality already existing collections to provide the glue between them. This is the methodology which under which I also mean the tools themselves, but also the again, the situation of the tools speaking one to another. So all the converters and other pipelines to combine those tools into chains of actionable tool chains, but also the methodological knowledge or some methods and some good practices. But finally, or last but not least, network of scholars. That's also a part of an infrastructure, so that you've got educated audience. You've got some people that might not be doing what you do, but they understand your point. That's the problem when CLS, Computational Literary Studies, tries to speak to traditional literary studies people. There is very little understanding, and that's one of the issues to be overcome here. So yeah, this CLS Infra is basically connecting people, data, tools, and methods on those many different levels. That's a separate question to which extent we are successful in connecting people and tools and data, but at least we did whatever could be done at a certain moment. So the outcomes of this project, among other outcomes, there are some training schools that we organized and workshops that we organized as well, usually as satellite events at major DH congresses, such as the DH conference in Washington, DC, or the coming one in Lisbon this year, but also the conference in CLS specifically that was introduced as one of the outcomes of the project. So CCLS conference, this is an annual event as well, but also we provide the so-called transnational, yeah, it's a typo, transnational access fellowships to young scholars to spend a couple of weeks in the respective partners of the consortium. But what you might be interested in, of course, all of you that have ever seen any European project and their deliverables, you know that this is not the kind of document you really want to read. However, here I would like to point you to one of the exceptions, and this is the deliverable 3.2, which is a survey of method. And we had an idea, actually, that I was the leader of the work package 3, Professor Christoph Schöch, that has an idea that, hey, rather than doing a very boring document no one is going to read, let's turn it into something that everyone can consult. And this is a kind of a textbook, except that it is it has a form of an interactive. It's not a PDF. You can make it to be a PDF with one click, but this is a living a website which is organized as a grid of panels or tails that you can click. Each of them is a chapter of that book, and you can read it either horizontally, if you're interested in corpora building for different problems, or vertically, if you're interested in a specific problem such as the gender analysis or canonicity, going all the way from the general remarks through corpus building evaluation, and then the bibliographic hints. So you can read it either horizontally or vertically, or if you like, you can make a PDF out of that and read it as a textbook. So that was the deliverable. I think you should give a try one day. Also, one of the outcomes of this project is a Discord server. In order to avoid the name distant reading, it was called latent reading Discord server, run by Artem Shelia from our institute, but also from the University of Tartu and from the Czech Academy of Sciences. So if interested, you can consult this server, find some information in there. Okay, with this being said, I don't want to bore you too much with this infrastructural big thinking, but instead I want to drag your attention to some actual text analysis problems that this kind of CLS field might want to attack. Text analysis and specifically some of the problems. I'll be very briefly showing you some applications, and then if you're still alive, I'll be very happy to shift gears and show some actual research question, how it can be cracked. So this text analysis can go in one of many different directions, including authorship attribution, as said already, and that's actually the field I like very much for its very nice to verify, evaluate new methodologies, because you've got basically a very clear-cut classification, and you can train your machine learning setup to test which features work best for that. So my favorite field is or has been authorship attribution, but it can also be something such as register analysis. So the analysis of is Hybro language different from Lowbrow language or Lowbrow literature. So the riddle of literary quality might be asked using these techniques. This is genre recognition. The question, which might be absolutely fundamental, what is the difference between prose and poetry? You'll know what is the difference, but linguistically, what is the difference really between them? And the answer might not be as trivial as what we might think. For example, in Latin, it has been discovered that prose and poetry differs in the way the prepositional phrases are being resolved or used in Latin. So the genre recognition might be an interesting question. Or for French drama, the question is tragedy and comedy different? And if it is, then in which direction? Translation. As we know, if we translate literary works or non-literary works for that matter into a target language, then some of the signals are still preserved, and we might want to observe to which extent the translator is visible in the target texts. There is this famous Mona Baker's hypothesis of. It was actually this hypothesis was put forward before the computational techniques. The hypothesis that says that if you've got a source language, then the stylistic variation on average should be bigger than if you translate those texts into a target language. Then you should be observing smaller stylistic variation. So that's a great playground to test this hypothesis by Mona Baker. Something which is referred to as mature style. Does it exist at all, right? If we just take different authors across different languages and styles, can we observe some features of mature style? It's a tricky question, but it's there for sure. And then style evolution, does style evolve over time or not so much? If it does, then is it universal? Can we think of writing universals or not that much? These are the questions that that text analysis is usually asking or addressing. My field specifically has been for some time stylometry and authorship attribution, which tries to address the question to which extent different authors form their own stylistic fingerprint or stylistic, features that can be told apart. Of course, application-wise, it has been this question has been asked in order to address the questions of the Shakespearean canon, who wrote some works of Shakespeare, the biblical canon, who wrote some of the disputed parts of the Bible. This kind of questions, I'm not saying that these are not interesting questions at all, because they are very, very much so. However, these are not particularly the questions I would like to look at. Rather, I'm interested in the general question of what makes an author, right? What makes individuality, stylistic individuality? So in my work, I rather focus on methodology rather than cracking particular authorship attribution problems. And what we know from the 60s on is that authorship attribution signal lives usually in the grammatical words rather than very, very infrequent characteristic words. We are better off if we look at those very frequent function words or grammatical words, which are very, very frequent and thus very nicely subject to statistical analysis. Now, if we are to compare to texts, I just need to make this disclaimer. I know that most of the people, if not everyone in this room, know it very well, but just to make sure that we're on the same page. If we think of textual features or language features, this can be, but doesn't need to be, they don't need to be, the frequencies of words or lexical features, but you can also go further to other textual features or language features, such as syllables or frequencies of morphemes or even phonemes, if you like, right? It doesn't have to be words. If I do some analysis based on words, it's not to say that that's the only way to do so. This can be going beyond lexis at all and going to some prosodic patterns, for example. Right? If you know, of course, how to extract them from texts. It's relatively easy to do from poetry, but more demanding when prose is concerned. This can be grammatical patterns that can be approached either different proxies, either a part of speech tag, n-grams, and you observe the frequencies of the part of speech n-grams, or by extracting some parts of the parsed trees, never the whole trees, never the entire trees because of their complexity, but the idea is to extract some fragments of the trees and then to count their frequencies. But you can also do some topic analysis on top of which you take the final topics as the indicators of the stylistic uniqueness. So there are many different ways of going into the style or measuring the language properties or language idiosyncrasies. I'll be focusing here on the words on the lexical level, but this is by far not to say that this is the only way of doing so. Again, the same applies to the methodology of finding those differences. There are many different ways of doing so, and I will be covering in this talk very simple ones, which is the distance-based methods. But yes, I know that you will say sooner or later, hey, but these are the large language models and other neural network solutions. I know they exist. They are very, very, very cool to do the things. But in order to understand what's inside, in my view at least, it is better to use a very simple method when you can control all the variables and then to observe what happens when you manipulate some of the parameters. Then distance-based methods are intuitive enough to just observe what's inside, right? So that's why I pick the distance-based methods here in this talk. And one additional, it's not a disclaimer, just to make sure that we are on the same page. I know that the people in this room are very familiar with this idea of a representation of a text as a vector of features, as a vector of here word frequencies, but as said a minute ago, it doesn't need to be word frequencies. It can be the frequencies of whatever you can measure in that text. Here, this is the frequencies, relative frequencies of the word. And now the idea is that a given text is represented by a column of these numbers or a row of these numbers, and then you compare those frequency profiles across your corpus, right? It doesn't have to be text, it can be text samples, whatever you might think of, but still, or the author classes, but still the whole text with its all complexities is reduced to just the vector of values. And this vector of values is repeated for all the texts you're going to deal with, right? So here it's an example of a very simple corpus of the novels from the American South. And the question here was a question, not a very serious one, but still the question of Harper Lee and the question, did she really wrote her second novel, To Kill a Mockingbird? Or was it Truman Capote that wrote it for her? So it's a very simple, approach to address that question. More advanced approaches exist for sure. Just to show you how it looks like. So we start with this table of frequencies across the corpus. Again, very similar representation is used by LLMs, but many other solutions in machine learning. Actually, almost every single application in machine learning sooner or later, uses this kind of tables of features. And that's, again, not the only way of getting the results. By far not the only one, but a usual way of a simple exploratory, non-supervised final results that you might wish to get is this kind of tree, or different ways of this, different kinds of this tree, in which you've got some branches automatically recognized by the computer, and now you just look at the picture and try to make some sense out of those pictures. Of course, a lot of the practitioners, observation is involved here that might not be wanted in every single situation, but this is a nice way to start, just to do an exploratory analysis of what we are seeing. And here, for the sake of convenience, all the different authors were colored using different colors. And as you can see, except for Faulkner, each author has been recognized as having, a unique and separate signal. So all those branches represent one author each. And then we have the Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird, and the same Harper Lee to Go Set a Watchman. As you can see, they are linked together and not linked to Truman Capote, which is a hint that maybe she really wrote what we think she did. More advanced methods confirm this general picture. So this is not to say that we should stop here, but just to show you how this kind of very, very, very shallow analysis might look like. Now, what I'm actually more interested in than just simple authorship is going beyond that and asking some questions of, for example, imitation, as in this example. Here we see a network of textual similarities. So I mapped textual neighborship relations onto a graph map. So there's a network representation, and I filtered the weakest signal so that only the strongest one and the second and the third rate signal is kept here in this picture. And what we can see here is 40 plus works, poetic works. So epic poetry, this is from Latin antiquity, Middle Ages, and early modern period. And the question here that we might want to ask is the imitation. Here we've got Virgil. This is Virgil, the Aeneid. The blue is the originals. Virgil is over here with his Iliad. And here we've got Vegius Supplementum Aeneidus, so the supplement to Aeneid by this Vegius. This is the Renaissance author. And as you can see, he's doing very well. He's quite close to Virgil, right? Here we've got another example. That's Lucanus with Pharsalia, another epic poem from the antiquity. And here we've got a medieval Mace Supplementum Pharsalia, so the supplement to Pharsalia. As you can see, again, it's quite close. We can argue that this imitation is quite similar in style. And here we've got a third example, which is Ovid with the Metamorphosis on Liber over here. And here's the follower. That's Galandus, Supplementum Ovidianum. Very, very thin relation is to be traced, but that's just a very, very thin thing. Right, so we might want to use, this is not a serious study, I haven't published that because this is kind of a toy study to show you what kind of directions you might follow. Because if it was a serious study, I would also supplement it with some proper machine learning supervised analysis. But here is just to show you the hint where this kind of analysis might go. Now, with this said, I hope you're still there and are ready to shift gears if this is okay with you, because I predict that some people here might feel kind of disappointed by the general level of this first part. So here comes the second part where I want to show you an actual, research question or actual methodological thinking behind measuring similarities between texts. Now, if you think of methodology of this distance-based or machine learning, generally speaking, machine learning approach to finding similarities between texts, there are three basically areas of improvement. One is you can tweak the classification method. So from the distant base, you can switch gears to support vector machines or kind of feature optimization techniques such as shrunken centroids. You might think of neural networks as your next step, right? So you can tweak this classification methodology. That's one direction. Another direction might be the so-called feature engineering. So you might apply some dimensionality reduction technique in order to get the most telling features first, and then to apply your analysis on those most visible features alone, for example, or some shrinking and penalizing features techniques, which are again a couple of those available. That's a second direction that you might want to explore. And the third direction is, of course, the very feature, the very choice of feature, what you want to analyze from your input text. And nowadays, because back in time, we're kind of in mercy of the lexical level of the word forms. Now, with the advent of the NLP technologies, we might first to put our input text into NLP tool and lemmatize it first, which might prove important for highly inflected languages such as Estonian, Polish, or Latin, this kind of languages. So you might lemmatize your input first, and then you use or apply your analysis on lemmatized forms. You might go one step further and first use NLP to translate your input text into grammatical representation, being part of speech, tag engrams or whatever else. You can also explore some other features like this prosodic features, whatever it is, right? So this is basically the third area of improvement, and there are some interesting studies exploring this kind of things. My study, however, will explore none of those. I will go in a different directions. I will try to convince you that this idea of word frequency. I mean, this absolutely fundamental, super simple idea that this is a moment when we can start thinking of some improvements to our methodology. Just the frequencies, right? What is the frequency? We take a text, we count how many instances of the word the it contains. So I will argue in a couple of next slides that here's quite a lot of space to improve. So relative frequencies is the simplest normalization we might think of. So if we have a text, this is probably Pride and Prejudice, as far as I can see, which contains 4,571 instances of the word the, less instances, occurrences of the word and, to, I, of, a, and so on and so on and so on. And so we've got this very, very long, vector or raw of numbers of occurrences. If we sum it up, it will give us the length of the whole text, right? The total number of words. So the relative frequencies is the simplest normalization ever. It's so elementary that I shouldn't even mention that. We just divide our occurrences by the total number of words, and that's the percentage. So the whole vector of all the frequencies should sum up to 1, right? As simple as that. We've got 3% of the these, 3 something of ands, and so on and so on. As simple as that. I know you're looking at me as, is as if I was selling you some scam, but it's not. So now let's try to think about, it's as simple as that, because the reason to do so is to normalize for the length of the input text. You'll accept that. That's an obvious solution. However, we very rarely think of the implications of that very simple operation. So we count the number of all the other occurrences, right? And then we divide our target word occurrences by the total number of other occurrences. So that's as simple as that, the simplest equation you might think of. But let's think of the consequences or implications of that very simple normalization. Of course, it's routinely used. It's everywhere. It's simple, and what I love about it, it's conceptually very elegant. It's like quite supernatural. However, if we think of frequency of the word the, for example, the question is, should we compare it against all the other words in our given text in question? Or maybe should we restrict to a subset of words against which it will show its expression or whatever? What I mean by that, let's think for a sec about synonyms. Synonyms, provided that they exist, because the linguists sometimes quite often claim that perfect synonyms do not exist, but we intuitively know what synonyms are, right? So they are very, very close in meaning. So on and upon, right? These two words basically mean the same, except that they're not quite, but they're close to be synonyms. Drink and beverage. Native English speakers would say, hey, but the beverage is usually alcoholic, drink can be whatever. But we can intuitively think that they are close to be synonyms. Buy and purchase, or big and large, or in Latin, ad, atque, and ac. These are basically synonyms. This is and, the 3 different ways of saying and in Latin. So my idea is, rather than normalizing by all the other words in our corpus, if we just restrict ourselves to normalizing by the occurrences of the synonyms, would that be a better solution for that frequencies? Let me show you what I think. Think of this on versus upon. Before I go any further, a very tiny excursion. One of the seminal studies in authorship attribution was the work by Mostler and Wallace back in the 50s or in the 60s, on the Federalist Papers, which is the papers dating back to the 70s and the movement for independence in the US. And some of the essays were written by Hamilton, some are by Madison, and some other remaining essays we don't know by whom. And this has been, you know, the a touchstone the case for authorship attribution for many decades now. And this Wessler and Wallace book read and paper, what the authors observed was that the function words are very, very good in telling apart those two authors. But apart from the fact that many other the function words work very well, there's one single feature, one pair of features that tells apart Hamilton and Madison. And this is on versus upon. And this single feature is enough to, it's a rare situation, I have to admit, but you know, this on and upon can be used as one very strong feature to tell apart. So my idea is, rather than normalizing by all the other frequencies, so the number of how many instances of the word on divided by all the other the words, what about just dividing by the number of those two synonyms? So a very simple normalization. Or it can be reversed, of course, the number of upon normalized by the sum of those two synonyms. These two would, of course, sum up to one, obvious, right? So that's a very simple idea over here. Now, if I just use this on versus upon, and I take 4 authors, the yellow is Emily Bronte, the green is Charlotte Bronte, this is Jane Austen, this pale color, and the violet is Anne Bronte. This is a normal the normalization, so relative frequencies, and this is this on being the proportion of the number of on over on and upon, right? As you can see, I'm not going to analyze this picture, but as you can see, those classes are kind of better visible here using this one particular example. If we take the word the, again, it kind of is promising, isn't it? It tells apart the authors somewhat better than the original version. So if this teeny tiny example works, what about doing it on scale? Well, there is, as the English speakers say, there is a fly in the ointment. So there's one problem to be solved, namely, so sorry for that. They tried to reach me. There is a problem, a single problem. I mean, the question, the notion of a synonym is not as simple as we might think it is, because in some cases we've got many synonyms, and for some other words we have no synonyms at all. So if you want to take 100 most frequent words or 1,000 most frequent words, and then for each of the words find a pair of a synonym pair, it might be a challenging task, if possible at all. So not only that, also if we think of the most frequent words of the words the, in, of, I, and so on and so forth, what is the synonym of the, really? What is the synonym of a, really, right? So the notion of synonym is kind of a holy grail, but it's not an easy task to pinpoint them. Absolutely, yes.
Do you prefer later?
Whatever works for you.
Why not just embedding similarity?
Why not?
Why just not clustered embedding similarity words? That's synonyms.
Yeah.
And that doesn't care about what classes, so you get synonyms for the and whatever.
Okay, so yeah, you just went to the conclusion of my talk.
I thought you were going to stick to the words on
this. Yeah. But yeah, that's
Go ahead.
like
For this reason.
Yeah. So that's exactly the idea that I use here, to go beyond synonyms by using one of the models that can capture semantic similarity without saying this is proper synonym. Let's forget about this proper linguistic theories. Let's be a bit fuzzy. So we want to capture some the lexical similarities. So for the word make, we would like to have the frequencies of the word say, that's the list, perform, do, accomplish, finish, reach, produce, maybe some more words against which we would like to measure this new frequency, right? The same about other words. So yes, I suggest to take a vector model instead. And people in this room are very much familiar with what vector models are. Basically, this is a multi-dimensional geometric representation of word similarities in terms of their semantic relations, which is captured by observing how they co-occur in a big collection of text. That's a rough description of what a vector model might do.
Yeah. Let me just say, you're hesitant, and you say many people in the room know. We're very multidisciplinary, it's a very multidisciplinary audience, and there may be PhD students from other areas catching up to whom these concepts are not well known. So I think particularly explaining these concepts, which seem so natural and almost boring to some of us, has huge value. So thank you very much for doing this.
Okay.
So
Very nice. Yes. So there are some models that people are usually familiar with. I mean, Word2Vec is the name that many people know. So is Glove as another model. Works differently, but the final product is very, very similar. Or FastTech is a big model, but the general vector space that it captures is very much the same. Also, all the modern AI or contemporary AI solutions are very, very heavily dependent on vector models. So yes, each word in such a model is represented as very similar to what we've seen for text, is represented as a row of number, which is the coordinates in a multidimensional space. So each word is a point, and now we can measure the distance between any 2 points, which is important in our context. So let's look at one of the models. I've picked the one that was very, very easy to train, the Glove model. If I take the word house and ask for its neighbors, then the model says the next similar words is where, place, then room, town, houses, farm, rooms, it's quite close, left, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's for house. That's hold them not. The neighbors for home is return, come, coming, going, London, because we are dealing with literary corpora, back, go, went, came. The neighbors for buy, sell, wanted, wants, sold, gets, send, wants, give money, and so on and so forth. Each of the words has its own neighbors, right? And now that's our target words, I would suggest. With there's going to be some noise, of course. Though those similarities are quite fuzzy, they don't belong to the same grammatical category. They are by no means synonyms, of course, but that's what I hope will give us enough information about semantic similarity. That's what we really hope to get. So now, instead of, but there's a big question, how big this semantic background should be, right? And that's going to be the subject of my experiment. So if we just take the 3 words or two word background, then the number of the occurrences of the word house would be divided by the total number of house, where, and place. So the word itself and its 2 neighbors. If we take a 5-word semantic space, then this final frequency, this new frequency, would be the number of occurrences of house plus its 5 neighbors, and their occurrences are summed up, right, over in the denominator. Same goes for any other space we want to have. The question, however, is how big this space should be, and that's the question I want to address in the following slides. So the experimental setup was corpus from this elder corpus that you've seen a couple of slides ago, 99 novels if in English. This corpus contains 100 novels, but one of them was anonymous, so I just excluded it, so that I have 99 works labeled for authorship. So there are like 33 authors, 3 texts per author, 99 in total. I tokenized it, and then I used the so-called cross-stratified scenario. So in each of the cross-validation folds, 2 texts for each author were randomly selected to form a training set, and the remaining 1/3 was the test set. I hope this is clear. If not, I will be happy to cover it. And then this distance-based classification was performed, and the accuracy, the recall, F1 scores were recorded. So I experimented with a couple of different distances. What is a distance? Distance is a way in which you think of the similarity between 2 texts. And there are many different ways in which you can capture this similarity. So I've just picked 4 of those. The classic Burroughs delta, which is Manhattan, the distance applied to z-score data or scale data. Cosine delta, which is cosine again applied to z-score data. This Eder's delta, something I introduced a couple of years ago to factor for an uneven distribution of words in a corpus, and a very, very simple Manhattan distance to compare those 3 against. Well, the results. So here I know that people love those interactive
Instance by just flipping characters, or
no, that's Levenstein.
what's the grid of Manhattan distance? The question.
What's the grid in Manhattan distance? So I will jump a couple of slides to show this picture.
Oh.
So if in a multidimensional space, we are talking highly multidimensional space here, just reduced to 2 dimensions. So let's assume that the first dimension, the x, is the frequency of a given word, of the word the, for example. And we've got a text A that uses the the not so frequently. And this y-axis is the frequency of the word upon, for example. So you can see that the word A is using the word the not very frequently, and upon also not very frequently, as opposed to the text B, which is more generous in those 2, in using those 2 words. And now the question, how to measure the distance between those 2 texts? We can do it either the Euclidean way, where we use the theorem of the triangles, and then we square those 2 the dimensions, and then we take a square root of the sum of the product. Or we can take the Manhattan, which is we independently measure the difference for the, for upon, for those other words. It can be many dimensions, and then we just sum up all those differences. So this is an overall distance. That's Manhattan. So go back to the results. So first, what people like is like 3-dimensional, this kind of cool pictures. I love them too, of course.
Only outside of visualization courses. Yes.
Absolutely, yes. So this final slide slice at the right-hand edge, that's the baseline. That's identical to if I took just relative frequencies. Whatever goes to the left, this is boosted frequencies. And here we've got on the X scale the depth of the semantic background. As you can see, there is an improvement in performance. I love this visualization, I really do. But if I just switch to something like that, so that you recognize it over here. That's a 2-dimensional, that's a very identical thing, yet it cannot be moved around. But here we can look just at what works and what does not. Here on the right side, we've got the baseline. So a very, very long the background is actually identical to the relative frequencies. Whatever is here on the right side is this reduced the semantic background. As you can see, we've got a huge improvement of the performance over the baseline. I was really struck to see how good it is. For longer vectors, for like 1,000 most frequent words, the gain is gigantic. So it really, really works to distinguish authors, it seems, for at least for cosine delta. But if we switch to Barrow's delta, there's also an improvement, not as big as in the previous case, plus it lives somewhere, it needs a bigger semantic background to really work. Whereas in the previous case, like a background of 5 to 10 words, very short background was enough to extract the signal. For this classic delta, you need like 50 words to see an improvement, but still it's like 5, 6 percentage points over the baseline. That's a huge improvement. I was really surprised to see that.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So this is sort of reminding of bandpass filters in music, right? Where you, if you want to phone in and you want to sample the drum, you take your control voltage from sort of like a frequency range where the drum is actually giving
Then you
signal,
subtract it, yeah.
and you get rid of all the other stuff. But obviously, if you find that and say, oh, this is really cool to distinguish these two authors, one may have a drum and the other may have not, you cannot use the same selection of words for anything else because you don't know if this other music has rhythm or not, or if the rhythm is actually confused with the bass line. So how do you deal with sort of like that you now found a really good filter, but your filter works for your problem, but not for all problems?
Okay, that's a fantastic question indeed. And before I address it, let me show you that the problem really exists if we switch to this Eder's delta. Again, this hotspot lives somewhere in the background for 50 to maybe 100 words.
Mm-hmm.
And if we switch to simple Manhattan, which is very bad, which just doesn't work because with normalization, without a normalization, it doesn't work. But look at where's the optimal area. It's in a different place. So yeah, you're right that there might be a problem of overfitting or fitting, the parameters exactly to the corpus, except that here I don't optimize it for particular authors. I just take, the general word-to-vec model, right? Mm-hmm. So there's some
baseline.
A baseline model to get the frequencies, those boosted frequencies, despite the authors that were involved in this corpus. Mm-hmm. However, your question is absolutely valid in terms of this background. That it's really difficult to say which is the actual background you should stick to, right? To which extent this is just dependent on this very corpus, or to which extent this is universal. That's exactly the question we might want to address on a larger scale. So I don't know when it comes to this second part of your question.
Okay. Sir?
Yeah, that's
great. Let's just go.
So we've seen that.
What does the Eder's delta do? Can you explain it?
I would be very happy to. Manhattan does nothing to the data set except it computes those frequencies, those differences per particular dimensions, and then it subs it up. Mm-hmm. What classical delta does, it first scales the word frequencies. Why that's important? Because the frequency of the word "the" is several orders of magnitude bigger than the frequency of the word "home" or something like that. Mm-hmm. So if we want to have a real multidimensional setup, then we'd better scale those features, right? So that's what classical delta does. It simply takes z-scores across the board and only then applies the Manhattan distance. And the error delta assumes that after all, there's more signal hidden in those very frequent words than in the very, very non-frequent. So what it does does the z-scores, that the z-scaling across the board, and then it cuts off the values. I mean, according to the rank of the word. So the first word, the word D, gets not cut off at all. But the final one, it's like 99.9 is being cut off of its value.
So you basically, like, again, to speak in filter terms, you apply some kind of tonnage thing, and then you basically do.
This is exactly a filter,
And it's just linear with rank.
It's linear, yeah.
It's linear with rank.
Yeah.
So it's just a threshold cut.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can be made non-linear, but in this application, it's purely linear indeed.
Why it depends on the rank, but not on average value.
On average frequency, you say.
Yeah.
Then it would be dependent, back to your question, then it would be very much dependent on a particular corpus, particular language, and whatever.
Yeah, but it seems to be at the first glance to me seems to be methodologically more little because the amplitude of fluctuations is proportional to square root of frequency.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, that might be an idea to implement.
But anyway, it is.
Yeah, but since
reasonably
yeah, since you've discussed that, what I'm not a very big fan of is to tweak every single feature individually. And here I would have to scale them, individually depending on their expression, right?
The systematic procedure which can be automated.
Yeah, I would be more up to using some non-linear, but a general model to feed the behavior of the features.
So let me sort of like plug on that. So frequency goes over several orders of magnitude if the corpus is large enough, and rank too. And for rank to be stable, your frequency has to be stable, but your frequency can be stable without the rank being stable. Like if we approximately sell 20,000 CPs every year, but we have like plus minus 100, then we fluctuate around each other in rank, but our frequency essentially is the same. So one of the key questions in this whole business of ranking, not just in verbs, but in all sorts of places, is indeed sort of like, should we look at rank or should we look at raw frequency? And so it seems to me that you sort of like, by deciding you go for rank, which is obviously, verbs sort of broad. That's what people with words do, because there's a tradition. You buy some fuzziness. You get some fuzziness, which you would actually get rid of if you would look at raw frequency in a sense, right? You see what I mean?
Yeah, provided that the texts are identical in length, right? And you don't have to normalize it by the length at all. Then yeah, I agree that occurrences might be a good proxy. Because I totally agree that the rank is not the best proxy ever.
And related to that, what's the relationship to like the discussion you brought to the table? It's very similar to the discussion historically that went into calibrating TF-IDF, like term frequency. We're talking frequency where whenever people use the word and have spent too much time with it, they have like a half-day debate of what corpus is like the large corpus in a sense, right? And so do you see this sort of like computational literary studies benefiting from that, or is it like just something completely different?
Yeah, it's kind of completely different without knowing about each other's existence, I would say. And some of the most seminal works by John Burroughs, the mentioned person, he was a very brilliant thinker, except that he didn't know that he was reinventing the wheel many, many times.
Okay.
And not only himself, but also David Hoover, who introduced the idea of culling, which is eliminating the features that are, it's basically reinvented TF-IDF.
Okay.
In a way, it was very same idea, but the implementation is slightly different. Without knowing that it already existed. That was, yeah. I have been always fascinated by this fact, how these guys don't speak, those two camps don't speak one to another.
It's almost like you should hire in your era chair a mathematician who sort of like defines the superclass of the problem.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay,
It gets.
he's hired.
Yeah. It gets more and more difficult not to hire such a person. Yes, and back in time, all those small camps were kind of isolated. Today, it's not so possible anymore not to speak to these other camps.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm not sure how much time we have, but let me just wrap this up, perhaps. So the improvement is just big. Still, the cosine delta, which has proven to be one of the best classifiers, is the best also with these boosted frequencies. However, after boosting, the final F1 is just 12% point better than the baseline, and that's a big thing. However, with this side note, that the 12% percentage point the gain is not for the best set of input parameters ever. The best set of input parameters gains like 6 or 7 percentage points. Let me show you right now how it looks like. So now what I took a baseline. So I generated from scratch the same experiment, this time using pure relative frequencies to get a baseline. And then I subtracted just the F1 scores, the baseline from, or the boosted from the baseline. And here's what I get. This is the gain, the difference. Here is no difference, or the difference is negative, right? And the closer we are here, the closer we are to the baseline. So this is basically the baseline, which is roughly, should be at 0, and more or less is. And here we've got the gain. And as you remember, the best results were absolute best results were in this area for longer vector of features. However, relatively, the biggest gain is over here. It's the set 12 percentage point, right? So if we are talking about the best obtained scores ever, the gain is like 7 percentage point. This is still a substantial gain to my view. That's for cosine delta, that's for Barrows delta. As you remember, those not very big semantic backgrounds did not bring much to the table. So as you can see, this is the gain, like 3 percentage point, 4 percentage point, something like that. More for those not very optimal settings, like 250 most frequent, or this kind of thing. For Eder's delta, very similar picture to that of the classic delta for some reasons. And for Manhattan, gigantic, gain. However, still in absolute terms, Manhattan cannot overcome. Simple Manhattan without the feature normalization, feature scaling cannot outperform delta and cosine delta at the first place. So yeah, to the conclusions, unless you've got some questions, you will have some questions anyway. Yeah. So yeah, in each scenario, there was a big gain. I was really surprised to see, and in some setups up to 12 percentage points, but for the best the performing combination of features, it was up to 6-7 percentage points. So I think this is still a thing to consider. And what is cool about this new method, it's conceptually simple, does not require any NLP, like any UD pipe or anything like that, right? Just a different, just need a model, right? A vector model to compare your frequencies against. That's all you need.
So you can work on the command line with block.
Absolutely, yes. So that's what makes it kind of attractive, I would say. Except that I never had time to really implement it, but yeah, that's it. Unless you want to hear more, but
thank you very much. We have about half an hour, a little bit more than half an hour for discussion, and I think we should just, there's a whole bunch of people.
Ask a very fast question. Is there a reference for?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It was the CHR conference in Antwerp, and the paper is there.
So what I want to say about discussion, we got a little bit more than half an hour, and Andres got a bunch of questions. And then please raise your hand in Zoom if you got questions. The sort of marching order in the room is either move up very close to Maciej or speak up, because his machine is the microphone.
Okay, okay, so question. So all of these different permutations or variations that you showed in those graphs, it's basically the same method, right?
Yeah.
Underlying, it's just different ways of operationalizing different distances. So I would be interested in some sort of comparison. How would it compare to some baseline? Did you also try it? But also how, like some even simple baselines, let's say word counts, does all of this machinery improve on just TF-IDF? And also the sort of related question would be why, I mean, you're using basically technology that is now over a decade old, which is this word embeddings. Why not just train a pre-trained language model as a multi-class classifier and predict the class which would be the author?
Yeah,
so
that's
basically, have you tried or would you consider comparing both to simpler methods and more recent methods?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions. To address the final one, which is why not using some advanced language models as a classifier itself? Well, yes, it works okay when your training data is okay, when you've got a lot of training data. When you don't, then the simple like KNN classifiers, this kind of simple methods tend to work better.
I mean, the semantic. So you're using word embeddings.
Yeah, I do.
But
yeah.
you could use context-aware embeddings and train that model like a bird model.
Yeah, but what would be the gain? I don't, on theoretical level.
Well, that's what I'm curious about. Like, what would be would it be more accurate, less accurate? Maybe actually just counting words is enough. Like that.
That's
something that probably works.
I get the question. Yeah,
like how it's situated.
But I've seen so many times people taking context-aware embeddings and then just averaging them out, which is basically equivalent to just playing.
Not average, predict. So basically, train. You can use it as a pre-trained language model as a base, but you can train it as a classifier based on, because you have some text, because you trained the globe, so you must have some.
Yeah, absolutely.
Basic, so that's your training course.
Yeah, very much doable. Yet in this simple approach, what you can do is you can calculate your new frequencies, I mean input frequencies, and only then start from there and put it or treat it as an input data to some more advanced classifiers. Right. So this is a simple way just to prepare the input frequencies. But I get your point that you want already introduce these tweaks on the very first. Yeah.
Then you just train the classifier using these
trainings.
This can do it. We just did it for another project. But also I'm curious, like how it perform compared to just something even simpler like TF-IDF, because sometimes that's what's enough.
Yeah, I say it's not enough.
But have you tried?
Actually,
sorry, that's a very
it's not enough.
That's actually my question. Have you tried?
No, yeah, I did. I have tried that. I have tried that indeed. And TF-IDF is not the best solution ever for the following reason. What it does, it cuts off all the function words, because the IDF part of the equation just cut them, zeros them out, right? So
if they differ, if they don't differ between documents, but you had one example where they can differ actually.
You've got the function words across the board, and then the IDF part would be 0 or right? Or not 0, 1, just 1. So it will be.
I mean, TF-IDF just watched how the function works because the words are repeated between
Yeah,
authors,
yeah.
right? But you had some example of where actually between two authors they might not be.
Yeah.
Same.
The next one is Anastasia.
Yes, thank you so much. Do you hear me? Because sometimes
Very well. So
okay, thank you so much. I have just one formal question for clarification and one conceptual question. So the one that perhaps I just missed it and did not understand. Could you please show the slide with the formula? Yes. So, so the question is, well, there can be some words that actually can have many senses, and we understand that place can be in a lot of wordings, which means something absolutely. Well, another thing that a house like take place can be very, very frequent. So do you think it really can have some impact? I mean, perhaps with some words it goes better, but with some words it goes worse.
Okay, yeah, I get the point. So that's why this context-aware vectors might be a better idea here. However, here I don't really compute anything in the vector model. What I do look at is how many words, I mean, the most similar 7 or 5 or whatever my background is words are registered or visible in the model. Then I come back to the original text and I count the instances, the occurrences. So if my work in question uses the place in a weird meaning or doesn't use it at all, I just count it as many times as it appears, say 0 times or 100 times, whatever it is, right? So that's the vector model is only a reference point, which specific words I have to put into this actual counting in my texts, right? Now, to address your question on a theoretical level, because I cannot say for sure because I didn't do any comparisons, but normally what you do, you just compare your word, whatever word it is, against all the other words, thousands or hundreds of words in your text, and you don't care about the change of the meaning or whatever it is. Just take all the stuff, all the noise, and we can live with that. So my proposal is, hey, let's reduce some of this noise, and there's probably still some noise left. I'm not going to say it is not. I just want to cut off the tail of the words that are probably semantically less relevant to the question in question, right?
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. And so my conceptual question is directly connected with your answer, because is it correct to say that actually we use kind of not words but concepts in our classification, like semantic concepts?
It would be sweet, but I'm not sure.
But because you still rely on the semantic differences, even if there can be other meanings of the word and the word can be used in other meaning, but still you try to aggregate some kind of ideas, that words that carry some
I get the point,
similar
but
ideas.
I don't really do it here. That was another project of mine that I think of doing one day. I mean, taking one word after another and see in the vector model, and in the vector model to define the predefined list of 1,000, say, concepts. And then for each word in the input line to see which is the closest concept to my word in question, and then to replace them as, you know, as you lemmatize. If you lemmatize a word for a highly inflected language, then for each word, you look which is its, you know, closest concept, which is the lemma, right? So I was thinking of doing the same with the semantic dimension by, you know, defining some 1,000, say, base words or whatever, and then for each actual word to look what is the closest base word, and then to replace it, and then to count those say semantic lemmas, right, instead. But this is something I haven't done yet. I'm just thinking of maybe doing it one day, of making more and more general in terms of, you know, using this vector space.
Thank you.
Isn't there sort of like one point that is quite interesting? There's another chance for one of those sort of like horizontal mean transfers, because named entity recognition does exactly that, right? I mean, you basically replace the n-grams or the words with actually what they mean, meaning some kind of concept, and you can actually also do this sort of like more generic, like if you have a bunch of proteins that are mentioned in a text and you know this whole text is about C. elegans, even though the word C. elegans is never said. So this kind of stuff is sort of something where I think it would be really interesting to talk to the knowledge graph crowd, which is another one which is really, really large. What I'd like to sort of like pivot a little bit is like actually the opposite question of like, oh, can you not just use machine learning, you know, neural network embedding, whatever, but one of the key questions is not just like how similar are authors, how similar are sort of like two books, but what is the nature of style?
Oh, yeah.
And so I myself, being an art historian, you know, we're very proud of like having come up with at least two concepts of style, namely Baroque and mannerism. Mannerism is very straightforward, you know, elongated necks and elongated sort of like, you know, peripherals of your human body. But Baroque is completely made up. It's because a bunch of art historians essentially hated late Renaissance. And so, you know, it basically means like sort of like, you know, it was very, very derogative as a meaning when it came up. And now we use Baroque in all sorts of places. Like we use it in music, we use it probably also in literature. I'm not a literature historian. But one of the key questions is indeed, what even is this? Like when I see it in a painting, I can say, oh yeah, that's Roman Baroque. But what do I actually see? That is sort of like not as straightforward. And I think that's where your sort of like approach sort of comes in, because sticking, you have two options. Either you stick with these sort of like really face value things, like the actual words, or if you actually buy into, say, oh, let's do a neural network model, and then we have some weird weights trained on ImageNet. So you get 2,000 numbers or 768 numbers that say something about the text, and two texts have these vectors, and we compare them. Then you have the opposite question where you have to analyze what do your vectors actually mean in order to get closer to this kind of style thing. And my simple question, I could, you know, obviously bring a lot of examples from artists. In computational literary studies, how close do you come to what's the nature of literary style?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question indeed, and the answer might be quite disappointing, I would say.
Okay.
First, before I go to the question itself, the first disappointment is when you think of a representation of a text. You say the vector of a number of words or word occurrences. If you consult the real, you know, machine learning people or neural network people, then they will say, hey, we don't need your words. We just need sequences of characters. We don't need even your morphemes or syllables or whatever. Give us just, you know, sequence of characters, and we'll do character n-grams, like 3 characters in a line, whatever, even if they mean nothing. We just need 3 characters in a line. Then we do TF-IDF. That's actually the second part of my answer to your question. If we do TF-IDF not on words but on n-grams, character n-grams, then yes, the improvement is there. and then we put it into the machine, and then the machine is a super nice classifier. Well, yeah, but myself as a linguist, I'm horrified that, hey, this is not language units. I mean, letter trigrams or character trigrams. What is that? We can say, tell apart two different styles or three or many different styles using just character n-grams and do some TF-IDF on top of that, and that's it.
I'm not advocating for it. I just use it as a simpler baseline to compare if that actually provides improvement.
Yeah, it does not when you do the words. It does improve when you do TF-IDF on the character level. Right. So back.
Wait. You say so basically TF-IDF for character level actually performs better
Yeah.
than your method.
Not better, but it's better than the baseline, than no TF-IDF weighting.
There's another thing one can bring in here. Like we have a recent paper here, like actually Tilman Ohm, one of our PhD students, with actually 3 people in the room here, about looking at images and trying to figure out, like looking at the same 10,000 images. So we've created a data set that has 10,000 images, which is 10 fruits and 10 styles, and throwing that at neural networks and algorithms that are measuring quantitative aesthetics, we can sort of disambiguate how good the model is in actually semantically differentiating, say, this is an orange, this is an apple, versus sort of differentiating the visual style, which would be very similar to your character.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
What's the noise?
Yeah.
Like, is this knitted or painted or something like that?
When you look at the second to last layer, and then, is it style what you're looking at?
Actually, it turns out that like we actually have a method which we call compression ensembles, which is rather tilted towards this sort of aesthetic sort of part. It's a little bit like recognizing the graininess of noise in a photograph, and it's knowing, but it doesn't tell you anything about the meaning of the photograph. While on the other hand, you have this thing that you sort of, neural networks seem to be optimizing both. So they're not clustering all the similar texts in the same corner, typically, when you do some kind of clustering with them, but they bring together some in a sort of semantic way, but then in other ways, they may be far apart in an aesthetic way. And so it seems to me that maybe the answer to what you're sort of like, or even the question, not even the answer, the question should not be which one is better, character engrams or semantic engrams, say, like named entities, but maybe you should do both and actually see how much does the style difference between Jane Austen and, I don't know, Charles Bukowski, how much is this aesthetic, like meaning character engram wise, and how much is it actually sense wise? So
I love this thinking very, very much, even if we have to accept that this aesthetic difference would be just a different representation, different, vector of numbers. If we can accept that, I can live with that, of course.
Yeah.
But, your general idea of separating, the semantic level and the aesthetic level, which seems to be intuitively graspable for like pictures, but in the case of text, it is very difficult to tell apart or to separate. You've got the words, and each word keeps some meaning. It will be very difficult to separate the semantic layer with the aesthetics layer. But I love the idea. I will be thinking hard how to approach that thing.
You can do actually maybe try to separate the historical dimension. The language is changing with time, and you can sort of try to
if you've got enough data
to look at the compared to sort of
what we know is that you mentioned the Zipf's law, so those frequent words are very, very frequent, and so on and so on, the very long tail. So this is the first Zipf's law, but there is also the second or a third, I don't remember, which says that the more frequent a given word is, the less blurry this when its semantics is concerned. So its meaning has just more meaning. It has a broader meaning, and the less frequent a given word is, the more specific its meaning is. So by extension, we can say that this semantic layer is mostly hidden at the tail of the frequencies, whereas at the top frequency word you will have not so much meaning. But this is not a solution I would be definitely thinking of. But you know, I really love this idea of finding a separation between those two somehow.
Thank you very much. I just learned that there's a third Zipf's law because I never read the book. So 1949. I should. To bring this to like a couple of days ago, I coaxed a large language model to write a holorhyme, and it contains the word combination of rats sings, which is actually sort of like phonetically leaning on Ratzinger, the name, like the Pope, while it also abbreviates the name and then adds the word sing. So it is really good at that. And so holorhymes have this thing that, like, since 20 years in hip hop or 30 years, this is a thing that is going on, where obviously we leave sort of like this whole Engram business towards something where you need to talk about the phonetics, you need to talk about the bigger picture. And one thing that comes to my mind is Bach, who seems to have been able to imagine the score as a picture and then just write down, which leads to the fact that he has Zipf's law in there, even though there was no concept for that. So the key question is there sort of the appetence in this field to bring in these other things? Like, you know, like art historians, they look at words, they look at the material of the paper, they look at the watermark, they look at the ink that has been used, or is that something where you would say, okay, you know, ever since Steve Ramsey and Lisp and TI, this has become a monolithic sort of like block of infrastructure standards and so on, and now we're locked in that crowd, and it's really hard to bring these other things in.
Yeah, that's a cool question indeed. Again, I think that the art historians have an easier job because in language, all those layers, there's plenty of those. I mean, it's semantics and then grammar and the syntax, you know, morphology and so on and so forth. It's plenty of those, but I think that they are collinear to a big extent. Of course, there are those signals just don't go into two different directions, because if you got a word, it implies some grammatical structure which is behind that word, right? I basically think of a language as being a many-layered phenomenon, on the bottom of which there is some language constraints that you cannot break. Of course, you can do it. Certainly you can, but then you will not be understood. So there are some language constraints that we should agreed on when we want to be understood. On the top level, we've got a like full freedom of choice, like infinite freedom of choice of the vocabulary. And there is something in between those stylistic patterns or those ways of expressing ourselves that we kind of like to stick to because of our education, because of our parents, because of the books we've read, some sociolinguistic dimensions, and so on and so forth, right? So between this language constraints and the full freedom, there are some, stylistic choices that might be unique or might be typical for some epoch, some taste of the epoch, or the fashion, stylistic fashion of the epoch, but also personal choices that are, I guess, we are self-limiting ourselves out of this infinite choice of vocabulary to some, some subgroups that we like best, that we like better than others. So this is something to explore, I would say.
I don't see any hands up. Maybe you would like to use the last couple of minutes to speak a little bit, that would be great, about this Era Chair initiative in Tartu that you mentioned, because that's one of the reasons people look at our stuff, because we have done something like that. It's actually not that frequent. So there's not that many of those. And I think people would be super curious of like what your approach is on that.
Yeah, so very briefly, the project has just started, so we don't really know what directions we'll be following. But what we know is that we want to start with. This is a 5-year European project, ERA chair at the University of Tartu, starting now, or has started very recently. We'll be hiring. We'll have a few positions to fill. I will cover them in a minute. So what we want to do is to establish a Center for Digital Humanities. And specifically, we want to be like language-oriented or text-oriented. Because of our limitations, we don't want to cover all those broad areas of digital humanities, such as visual arts. I would love to, but, you know, let's be modest, I would say. So we are going instead to focus, to restrict ourselves on what we're good at, which is text analysis. And this project has a few strengths. One of them is obviously the excellence in research that I will cover in a minute. The other is to develop the programs, the minor, if not major, in DH at the University of Tartu for the BA, at the BA level, at the MA level, and we also want to offer some courses for PhD students. But from what I know, in Estonia, the system is very similar as it is in Poland. So you cannot award just PhD in any field, but there is a dedicated list of fields that you can award your PhD at. So that excludes a DH for the time being from this PhD level. But we anyway want to offer some PhD courses. Now,
actually, we did something, this may be an interesting sort of like solution, because we're in Estonia, we had the same problem. We had PhD students in the ERA chair. And then what we did is we instituted a master's level course, which could be taken by PhD students, actually, because we were sort of like working across 3 university schools of the 6 schools. And basically, this course could be taken by PhD students from all over the university. And that worked really, really well, because there's another problem which probably likely exists. When there is no PhD program for DH, you will have a lower frequency. And even if you say you fund 5, 6 PhD students in your ERA chair, then, you know, at some point they've taken the course, and then, like, you see what I mean? But it actually worked out really, really well, because these students typically then excelled in the group work and even sort of like work with master students and so on. So you get this sort of like cross-level benefit,
this is
which
cool,
was really, really cool. And it was bureaucratically sort of super simple to achieve without hurting all the programs and all the, you know, whatever goes into that. You know.
Okay, yeah, good to know, good to know. Thank you very much for the hint. So not only do we want to offer this the program development, but also another strand is LLMs. Now, with this side note, very important one, in LLMs, you say something and 1 month later, it's just obsolete. So 2 years ago, when we were writing the proposal, or 1 year plus ago, when we were writing the proposal, we had some ideas. I had an idea of establishing a team or a consortium of different institutions, including Caltech, the University of Tallinn, GLAM institutions, and most importantly, the National Library and the institutions that have some access to the data, in order to collaboratively train a large language model for specifically Estonian. But as said, you know, that was 1.5 years ago.
Yeah, you're already doing it now.
And they're already doing that. Which is great, of course, but yeah. But we still have it in our on our agenda.
I mean, it literally cost like €1 million, so
yeah, surely so. But
it's nice that they spend this money for you.
But still, the LLMs that exist, not all of them, but many LLMs that exist, they basically suck and download all the internet on their hard drives, and then start training the models. Without taking into consideration some, niche the representation of the language, such as historical documents, such as dialectal documents.
But there's no problem. I mean, what you can do is just take one of these like randomly trained models, indeed trained probably on like a bunch of stuff, mostly in modern language.
And then you
just
fine
adapt
tune
that,
it
yeah,
for yourself.
for your own purposes.
However, the idea is that not everyone wants to fine tune a model for themselves. Maybe this general model should also include some input, some weights, from.
That's not really how it works. I mean, you have the model which is just a bunch of weights, and they might include historical language, but they might not. But if it doesn't, then you just need to adopt it or pay somebody to do it for you.
Yeah, so that was the idea of including those other, also literary language and some other archives to.
Yeah, I mean, there's examples in digital events or computational humanities where people have done that. I think there's a bunch of people in Netherlands, I think, who did it for like Dutch and Old Dutch, no, maybe Old Dutch, but also Old English, I think. So yeah, it's definitely
Except
doable.
that the data set for the Old English exists, right? Whereas it's not really the case for Estonian yet.
Well, that's the thing. The National Library actually has all this stuff, and we are right now in the process of negotiating with them. So basically, it's a bit of a funny story. We asked for like 100 books, and then it took months, and then they replied and they said, "Oh, we now, because everybody now hates AI, we need to ask the Minister of Culture for permission as a library to borrow books out." And then they got permission apparently. Now they thought we didn't need a contract. Now they realized we do need a contract, but that's now being negotiated. But instead of like just 100 books, we're gonna have probably like a framework contract between Tallinn University and the National Library. But once we figure it out, then I guess Tartu University could just model on that, because the guy who is now the head of strategy in National Library is rather reasonable. So what you can do is basically once we get this done, and by autumn we will have, you can basically approach the same guy and say, okay, can we get the same deal? Because they have so much stuff, and it's digitized. It's in a machine readable format. So basically, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why we wanted to talk to them and to convince them to.
The guy who talked to is Krister Kruusma. He's a reasonable guy. Just basically approach him and say, okay, we also want that.
Great. Yeah, thank you for all the hints.
Super nice. We're hitting the 2 hours. I have to say something at the very end, but should I give you the final? You have some final words?
Well, yes. So thank you very much for having me. That's a big experience to be here finally here in Tallinn.
Thank you very much. I'm super fascinated whenever my good old friend Leon Battista Alberti is mentioned, because my PhD is 50% about Imperial Roman bath, and on average, people write something PhD-like about this since 25 years, and the first person was Leon Battista Alberti. He was certainly one of the original multidisciplinary gangsters, which we all want to be. And next week, we get another multidisciplinary...
Next week, we have no seminar.
Next week, we have no seminar. That's actually true. In 2 weeks, we have a multidisciplinary original gangster in network science and complexity science, who's Marton Karsai, who's from Central European University. That's the place that moved from Budapest to Vienna. And he's also the chief editor of Advances in Complex Systems. And so that would be a really interesting discussion too, about like what's the sort of like gamut of possibility of cultural data analysis, but also, literature, art, and so on, in the sense of emerging complexity. See you in 2 weeks. In 1 week, I will be in Austria and Linz, where similar things are going on. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.